An easy example would be, we can look at little plankton that live at the surface, and they secrete, plankton secrete a calcium carbonate shell. Well, depending on the temperature of that water, they will substitute magnesium for the calcium. So I can exploit a modern day relationship and say, okay, today, how much, I can do studies and I can grow plankton at 70 degrees, 65 degrees, 50 degrees, and then look at the magnesium to calcium ratio to understand how that substitution happens. And then take that relationship and apply it to a climate archive and go, okay, I've got 10,000 years of ocean sediment, and I'm gonna look at what the magnesium calcium ratios in those fossilized plankton is through time, and I can create a thermometer of it. It gives us an idea. It's not absolute by any stretch of the imagination, to your point, right? So I think, the magnitude of change sometimes needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because the error bars can be sizable. And the further back you go, the bigger the error bars get, right? Like, we can determine ocean temperature, like paleo temperatures of the ocean 10,000 years ago with some pretty good precision, right? You go back millions of years, like those CO2 thermometers, like those CO2 proxies, like look at the error bars on some of these things. Like, okay, it's 2,000 ppm plus or minus 1,000. They're huge error bars. So to your point, you gotta take magnitude with a grain of salt, for sure.
I'd like to make a couple of comments.
Oh, yes.
So the IPCC has 11 models, and they're the standards body behind the UNFCCC, which is the Paris Accord. This has been going on since about 92, because that's when the IPCC was formed, before even the UNFCCC existed. You can put random red noise in those 11 models, and they project an upward trend. They can't reproduce the medieval warming period or the mini ice age. So the models themselves, the more complex they get, the less accurate they are over time. So climate change in and of itself, while CO2 rise can be observed in our lifetime, climate change itself can't. So for us to say, I'm observing this even over 30 winters, it's not a reliable indication of what climate is doing. Climate is constantly in a state of change. And it localized to global is not a jump we can make.
Yeah.
Within a 600-mile radius, the trends fall apart. So these models are way too sophisticated to be accurate. We have 30 years of satellite data that shows CO2 is a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. In other words, CO2 rises after the temperature and not as indicative of the temperature is going to rise because of the CO2. So for me, science is hypothesis, debate, conclusion, another hypothesis, debate, conclusion. So, I think there still is a lot we need to know. As an example, the oceans. We don't know anything, literally anything, about the ocean's role.
Mm-hmm.
These models also that the IPCC has do not attribute any internal forcing. It's all anthropogenic. So they're saying that there's no natural force on the climate. So I think, policy and politics have corrupted a lot of the process.
Can I play devil's advocate for
Please.
With you, Brian? Because there's a lot to unpack there. I think to say we don't know a lot about the oceans is a total mischaracterization of what we know. I think we know a lot about the oceans and the role it plays in climate. I think the problem we don't understand well is the interplay and the feedbacks between the ocean, the atmosphere, the biosphere. Earth's climate system, and Earth in general, is the most complex system in the world to understand, right? And how, we understand what the ocean does well, we understand what the atmosphere does well, but the interplay between them, right? And so kind of to your point, I would say that the more complex the climate model is, the less accurate it is. I don't know if I would say that. I would say that the people trying to draw very finite conclusions from global climate models are misrepresenting the data, right? And so like, you know, global climate models are great at telling us macro, like looking at the feedbacks, right? And like the macro trends, but trying to like dig down and make these predictions of like, oh man, we're gonna see 10 feet of sea level rise in the next 30 years. Like there's a big leap of faith that's happening from like the climate model to like that statement, right? And a mischaracterization. I mean, look at the model ensemble here. Like, I mean, there is a whole spread. This is the same climate model that's run a bunch of different times. It gets a bunch of different results, and so they plot the shaded area to show you basically like the range of uncertainty within that climate model. And have you read Steve Koonen's book, Unsettled?
No.
So Steve Koonen's book,
yes,
Unsettled,
yes, I have.
is actually a pretty good critique. And in that book, he does the best paragraph in that book is on climate models. He's a physicist. He knows them way better than I do. And he kind of talks about you get these ensemble runs, but yet someone wants to tell you about the most extreme scenario. Like, oh man, look at this. It saw a 3-degree warming. That's not really representative of the full model ensemble itself, right? And so like, I think people make like these leaps of faith that like they overstate what the model is telling them. And they're trying to get too finite in their conclusions. Like the best GCM in the world has a 60 by 60 mile grid. And we know that clouds are a big unknown in the climate system because they can have a warming effect, right? Like on a warm day, if it's cloudy at night, you trap more air in so that low temperature doesn't go as low. On the flip side, on a sunny day when it's cloudy, like today, now, finally, the sun's reflected into the atmosphere, right? So it's almost impossible when your grid box is 60 by 60 because you're integrating the entire feature between basically what? Fort Collins to Castle Rock out to Lyman, like that's your box size that you're modeling. So people who try to make these finite conclusions from a big climate model like that, I think is part of the reason why some of the climate science and the conversation has been totally hijacked and misrepresented, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but I don't think anyone addresses the satellite data. I mean, I don't believe CO2 personally is a leading indicator. I believe it's a lagging indicator. And it's such a small percent of the atmosphere. I think we could do better than what we're doing today.
So you don't think CO2 is a greenhouse gas? Do you not believe that
I
science?
didn't say it's not a greenhouse gas. I said the satellite data shows it's a lagging indicator that CO2 increases after temperature and is not before. So the CO2 rise is not what's creating the temperature. The CO2 is rising after the temperature has increased. That's what the satellite data shows.
So I'd love to see that study.
I'll get it to you.
I would love to see that study.
Yeah,
because, I mean, I think in past climates, like when you go back and you look at like the ice core record, it's hard to look at lead lags when your resolution's, a few hundred years per data point, but like, I think you can probably make the argument that CO2 was definitely passive because a lot of what's driving that climate signal is solar forcing, like how much, in a balanced environment, balanced climate, without humans, a lot of that's driven by how much energy you get from the sun, okay? And so, yeah, CO2 and the oceans play a big role in sequestering carbon, and so a lot of that signal, yeah, CO2 is probably passive. But I would be hard-pressed to say that today CO2 is passive. And I can't say I've ever come across a study where, I've never come across a study that has suggested that with modern day data. And so I'd love to take a look at it and see where those authors are coming from. Because at least for me, I would be hard pressed to think that CO2 is really a lagging indicator. But I mean, again, it's the complexity of the system, right? And it's the complexity of the data. And I think it's why people who generally make one way or another, whether it's you're against climate change or you're for climate change, making like these sharp, decisive predictions about climate gets you in trouble. And that's, I think, maybe a takeaway from this conversation.
And I just think science always shows us tomorrow what we don't know today. And in too many areas we're told, accept the science, accept the science. That's not science. Science is about the discussion. So I don't think you'll get everyone they're to agree on those 3 points in front. There's not enough data
Well,
to confirm them.
yeah, and that's fine. I mean, but at least we're having a conversation,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, like, ultimately, like, having a civil conversation about this and hearing different viewpoints is what people need to do, because, all too much these days, people just want to yell and scream and drown out people that don't agree with them. And so, I mean, having more did anybody know Scott Tinker? Ever heard of Scott Tinker? I got to talk to him yesterday. It was a treat. And it's funny because he referred to people like us as the radical middle, right? Which I really enjoyed, because I was like, it's just like having these conversations and these debates with data, right? And it's like, that's what we need to do. And so if you don't agree with everything I showed, but we can have a conversation about it, like, man, that's what I'm here for. As long as you don't trash me on LinkedIn or something, or like, equate me to like Alex Epstein, then, so.
You never know, right?
You never know. Any other questions? I know we're butting up to 12:30, but
Do you have one?
yeah.
First of all, thank you so much. Great presentation. So much material. I would say few in the way of tutorials of what people don't know.
Yeah.
So we talked about oil and gas. We talked a lot about renewable. There's one thing so powerful.
Nuclear.
Nuclear.
Yes.
And you believe that would be the answer. What I
I so agree. So Will Jordan is the general counsel for EQT, and EQT is the largest natural gas producer in the U.S. And I got to meet him last week at Stanford. And man, like, even natural gas companies, like, you want to solve the problem? Nuclear. And it's really like, I've asked people their thoughts on this, right? So, like, who saw the news last week that Germany turned off their last set of nuclear reactors? Oh boy, right? Like, it's crazy. Like, France is all in on nuclear, and Germany is turning off their nuclear reactors, and they don't even know what they're going to do. And when I look at this, I ask people all the time, like nuclear experts, like, is that true? And a lot of people just say that, yeah, they don't, the Fukushimas and the Chernobyls and the 3 Mile Islands of the world kind of, scared a lot of people off. But I totally agree. Like, if you really want to solve the problem and do it like really quickly without any of this hardship through here, like nuclear, like, people need to wrap their heads around nuclear as fast as they can. The new micro reactors, they're cheaper, they're safe, they're easy to build, it's scalable. I heard a stat, and I don't know how accurate it is, that like all the nuclear waste from the world from all the nuclear power plants would not fill a single, what is the Broncos Stadium now, and Power Field or whatever. Like, you could put all the waste and it wouldn't fill a football stadium. Like, it's just, I completely agree. I mean, nuclear, the fact that no one is, I hope and I pray that nuclear, like, if I came back in 5 years and gave this talk again to this group, what would make me really happy is if that nuclear line is suddenly going up. Because I agree, nuclear has to be part of the mix.
I think it will with the, a lot of things all the change going on, right? Right now, we have Biden administration very biased and clueless about oil and gas.
Yeah.
For the most part, eating a lot of, I would say, news on it doesn't make a lot of sense. But one thing, it's change. Believe it or not, as we are proud of being U.S. citizens, we put the faith in China, heck no, right? So we have to put our head together and do the answer. Just right now, we don't see it yet.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So back to Germany, like, I grew up in Europe, and Lithuania used to have a nuclear plant that shut down, and I actually had like the same reactions, like, why are they doing this? And actually, even in Germany, the plant that got shut down, it was extremely old, and it was the risk of like some hazardous stuff coming out. So it wasn't shut down because, like, let's be clean. It wasn't shut down because of those bases, like, that's how, like, sometimes the media turns it. They're like, oh, we're shutting down, so we don't care. It was actually issues, technological issues, because those
Just
ones
obsolete.
yeah, so, like, and yeah, they could have done differently. They could have bring it up, like other plans,
Yeah.
to support that 100%. But interestingly, I had a very interesting conversation with Excel, and you know, like, it's like how you stabilizing the grid, you know, in the, you know, all these things, like, right, sun, it doesn't shine all the time, solar has its own issues. I think solar actually, some of the solar plants causes some of the heating temperatures too, because they basically becoming a desert, you know, when you just put the panels like miles and miles, you know, away. You know, wind has its own issues, and above and beyond, I think we need all of it, like the good mix of it. But they actually, finally, they like, it's nuclear. So we have nuclear plants that nobody talks about. That's how Excel, stabilizing the grid and making more reliable, it's actually nuclear power that's what's backing everything up. But like, how often do you hear that? Like, not really ever, right? And we have it here.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in New Hampshire, where I grew up 15 miles from a nuclear power plant. Like, it was just like part of my life. Yeah, I think maybe what might be a little bit encouraging is with the IRA. There was funding in there specifically for some nuclear plants like out west in California to provide maintenance, so they didn't become like, I think they're realizing, oh, we might not want the nuclear plants around, but like they're going to have to stick around to provide that reliable source for some time. And so in the IRA, there was some funding for nuclear as well. And so hopefully people continue to start to understand that nuclear can underpin all of this, right? And man, like if you don't have to worry about windmills, I mean, you look like I didn't talk, you know, windmills and the bird migrations, right? You hear that, the golden eagles in Wyoming is a big thing. I mean, it's just like, it's such a complex topic, but like, yeah, this is just one small piece of the talking points that hopefully you guys learn a little bit of something about it. And yeah, it's just, if you want copies of the slides, I'm happy to share. And I can also provide the IEA report, which is 270 pages, but it's like mostly pictures, so don't worry, it's like, it's very easy to read. But anyway, yeah, thanks for coming. This was fun. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.